My name's Adam Alter. I'm an Associate Professor of Marketing and Psychology at New York University Stern School of Business, and I have an affiliated appointment in the Psychology Department. Yeah, so a substance addiction or a traditional addiction involves the ingestion of a substance into the body. So that could be a drug or alcohol or some other substance that reacts directly with something in the body, something with the physiology, something in the brain, and that leads to this addictive state or these consequences that are obviously not very good for us a lot of the time. A behavioral addiction is different. It's much newer, and it involves addiction to something that does not involve the ingestion of a substance. So maybe the earliest examples were gambling, cases of gambling, where you could interact with a machine that had been perfectly designed to capture you and capture your interest and attention just by dishing out just the right kinds of rewards on the right kind of schedule. But now, in the world of screens that we're inhabiting, there are so many different behavioral addictions, and they go far beyond just simple gambling, that I wanted to try to understand them better. Yeah, I mean, I think using the term pathological is key, right? For something to be an addiction, it has to be bad for you. So there are people who've used the word addiction to describe pretty much anything that we do over and over again and can't not do. So there's a really famous case of a psychiatrist in the early 90s writing an article about how breathing was an addiction. And the idea was we're compelled to keep breathing over time, so therefore breathing is an addiction. Obviously, the net effect of breathing is positive. You stay alive. So it's silly to say that breathing is an addiction. I think the big question is when we look at these kinds of behaviors like a flow state that you enter, if that produces good work, you're happy, the outcome of that is all positive, that's not an addiction. It's just something that you do a lot for whatever reason. It could be that it's engaging or enjoyable. If that flow state leads you to neglect social relationships and it leads you to become unhappy and depressed, or it has other negative effects, then we could start considering whether that flow state has led to an addiction. So it's really about the consequences. There has to be an ultimately negative effect in the long run for something to be considered an addiction. Yeah, I think a lot of behavioral addictions are basically about doing something that is incredibly myopic and short-term focused, and it's often very mindless. So that's exactly what people are looking for when they spend hours just scrolling through Instagram pictures or looking down the newsfeed on Facebook and realizing it's been an hour since you started. That's inherently mindless, and that's why people do it. It's a sort of escape from the real world for a lot of people. It's the same reason people sit at a slot machine. It's not actually because they're looking for that great high that comes from a win. It's because they enter some sort of meditative state where they're just sitting there pulling the lever and time melts away, and that's actually very therapeutic for a lot of people. So I think mindfulness is the opposite of that in the sense that it takes every moment and makes it something worth focusing on and thinking about and inhabiting. And that's anathema to the way we consume tech today and the way we consume screen experiences. So I do think mindfulness is a really good antidote to a lot of these practices because you start to audit your own behavior in a way that you don't normally or naturally. I think that's incredibly healthy when so much of the day, so many hours of the day are spent being inherently mindless. So I think mindfulness is exactly the right approach. Yeah, I mean, I think Kent Berridge's work on the distinction between wanting and liking is one of the most profound ideas in psychology in the last 25 years. I think it's an amazing idea, and it's really useful for unpacking a whole lot of strange human behaviors that don't make sense if you don't understand that wanting and liking are different. So if you think about someone who's in a relationship that's ultimately harmful, the partner they're with is essentially making them unhappy, unhealthy. What you find there is this great wanting to be with that person, despite the fact that you no longer like them or like the relationship. And so liking is this fragile state. It breaks down very quickly, but what's left is this enduring, very robust sense of wanting the thing that's harming you, even though you no longer like it. So I think when people talk about drug addiction or addiction to social media or whatever else, they talk about it in very loose ways, implying that you like the thing so much that you can't stop using it. And I think if you pursue that reasoning, it's very hard to really understand what's going on at a phenomenological level. Like if you think about what it's like to be in that state, if you just assume everyone likes what they're addicted to, you kind of miss the point. And it's the fact that liking has decayed and all that's left is this great wanting, even in the face of all these negative consequences. I think at that point you start to get a sense of just how deep these consequences are, or these states are, and how to start managing them and dealing with them, and the kind of habits you need to build in that are agnostic to liking. They're really just about how we can change what you want. And I think that leads to some really interesting interventions. I think, so, I mean, it really depends what you mean by should, right? There's the should that maximizes consumer well-being, and then there's the should that makes billions of dollars. They're very different shoulds. You should maximize the wanting if you want to make billions of dollars. I think you should focus more on the liking and making it an experience that people actually feel positive about. They come out of it and they say, that was enriching. I'm a better person for what I just did. I have better relationships. I have a better understanding of how to balance my time, things like that. That, I think, then ends up focusing much more on the liking elements. So it's making an experience that people come away from and say, I'm not ambivalent. That was really good in every possible respect. And that's not how most products are designed. And I think you've articulated why really nicely. And it is that if you can tap into wanting, that will be robust. It'll endure across the long run. And that's the way to do it if you want people to engage for not just minutes, but hours, days, months, and years. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing for me is how many behaviors that are inherently healthy or good for you, or at some level are good for you, can tip over into becoming obsessions and ultimately addictions. Fitness is a great example of that, because the bigger problem in American society is not that people exercise too much, it's that they spend too little time exercising. And so when you have a device like a Fitbit or a smartwatch or something that gets you off the couch, that's mostly a good thing. But for part of the population, those devices and the kind of feedback they give, the kind of progress they give you, the sense that you're making, means that you go way beyond the level that's healthy. And instead of consulting your inner cues that tell you I'm exhausted or my legs are sore or whatever, you just keep pushing through and you end up in pain. That's where the problems emerge. But I think, as you say, it's really important to recognize that a lot of these experiences for many people are actually really good. I don't think it's bad for everyone to have a Fitbit, as long as it's taking you from being sedentary to walking for an extra hour a day. That is going to have a net benefit. That's going to be a positive. It's just very difficult to draw the line. And so a lot of people find they get off the couch, they're walking a little bit, 10,000 steps, you get the little ding which reinforces it. The next day you say, well, 10,000 doesn't do it for me anymore. Suddenly it's 12,000. There are people who report walking around wherever they live, even at like 3 a.m. because they need that ding for 18,000 steps, which is absurd. So once it starts to take over your life in that way, and that doesn't happen for everyone, it's problematic. For those of us who are able to do it in a sort of moderate way, I think there are great benefits, and progress is essentially a good thing, I think. I think inherent in meaning is some sort of growth or progress or sense of self-actualization, if you want to use the Maslow's term, or there's some kind of higher order sense that things are getting better, or that things are good, or that you're connected to something that goes beyond yourself. All of that is inconsistent with addiction to the extent that addiction is A, very self-focused, and B, as we've discussed, negative. All of those states are generally positive, and so to the extent that an experience brings meaning to you, it's probably going to enrich you rather than make you feel worse off. So it's less likely that a meaningful experience will lead to addiction, unless you're addicted to that sense of meaning you get, and then it spills over and becomes ultimately negative. I think one of the biggest ways really otherwise positive experiences become negative is that they crowd out other more important things. So the marginal effect of spending an extra hour a day on this thing that used to be meaningful is that you spend an hour less with your children or your friends, or working on something that's really important, or exercising, or spending time outdoors. The opportunity cost of that extra hour is great, and so it ends up becoming worse for your well-being. So that's a bad thing. But in general, if something's meaningful, it's probably enriching you. Yeah, I mean, that was the reason I wrote Drunk Tank Pink, at least, was to suggest that there's just everything around you is shaping you in some way. You don't realize how it's shaping you or the extent to which it's shaping you. And so we have this sense that we are moving on a single directed path, and it's very self-directed, whereas you're kind of being buffeted one way or another. I think those effects are small in isolation, but when you aggregate them, you put them all together, you end up having big effects. And so Drunk Tank Pink was about these small effects that influence us. Irresistible was an attempt to look for the single biggest thing that I think is shaping how we spend time and engage with the world today, which is technology and screens. So when you put all of that together, there are lots of little things that are shaping us, and there are some really big things like screens and technology that are shaping us. And what's left over is, first of all, very little time in the day when you're not enthralled to one of these experiences, which means that you may have autonomy to some extent, but it's going to be confined to a really thin sliver of the day. It's one of the first things I did was to try to get a sense of how much time we spend on our screens. And between sleeping and survival activities and work, and then the time that we have that's discretionary that's spent on screens, we only really have a very small chunk of the day where we really have true power to do exactly what we want to do, which crowds out everything that's kind of personal and meaningful and idiosyncratic about one person's life that makes it different from everyone else's, that makes it unique and interesting and special. So I do think and I think people have been skeptical for a long time about the general notion of free will and autonomy, but I think this is just a sort of renewed call from the perspective of science suggesting, we don't have that much autonomy. But it's something to strive for, and I think we have the ability to craft a life that involves carving out more time for the things that are important to us. You just, again, have to be mindful about that. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about it. Some of it is in the domain of how we're shaped and shifted from one perspective to another. And I think you're absolutely right to suggest that if our autonomy has been eroded or is slimmer than we think it is, then if you're asking people to make choices based on autonomy or free will, it's pretty clear that that's limited. That's only a very small part of what's driving their decisions. To me, the far bigger issue with elections is expertise. You're asking people to make a decision that really is very complex. And a lot of decisions we have to make, big decisions we have to make, are complex. But voting decisions, I've done a bit of research on this. When you ask people to explain why they vote for the people they're voting for, they have absolutely no idea. If you say to someone, this is especially true in primaries. Let's say you're a Democrat or a Republican, and there's a suite of 15 candidates in the primaries before the federal election. People will have a very strong sense of who they support. Sometimes they waver, but often they'll say, I'm absolutely sure this is my candidate. And you say, how strongly do you feel about that? And they'll say a 7. And you'll say, do you have a sense of what that person believes? And they say, absolutely. And then you say, all right, now explain it to me. Why this person and not these other people? And when you delve even just one layer deep, they have no idea. And so this is known as the illusion of political sophistication. And I think it's just one more illustration of how little autonomy we have, that we have this sense all the time that we're doing things that they're of our own volition, we're doing them for very good reasons, but then when you delve a bit deeper, you realize actually there's not much there. We're doing it because we like the look of that person, or I feel like we could have a beer together, or some other reason that may be relevant to a small extent, but really it's having a much bigger effect on your decisions than you'd like to admit, or than I think you believe. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest driver of engagement is that humans are inert in the same way that physical objects are inert. So something has to act on us to change what we're doing or how we're doing it. So this is something that really begins with casinos in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where casinos did everything they could to remove the sense that time was passing. So there were no clocks. They're built so that it looks like it's always dark. You don't want to see the sun rising, for 3 consecutive days, realizing you're still at the same slot machine 72 hours later. And by removing these cues, people aren't shuffled along to the next thing, and they end up spending way more time on the slot machine, and that's beneficial for the people who are trying to extract every marginal dollar from you. And I think that same logic now applies to how you design video games. It applies to how you design social media platforms, any screen experience. Once you have people on the device, how do you keep them there? It's not that you keep making it sweeter and sweeter so they're just like, this is fantastic. It's that you don't remind them that there are other things to be done. So you remove every possible friction point for them, and they just sit there. They just keep doing it. And that's why, Facebook went from having this button that said load more, where you could click the button and the newsfeed would unscroll or unspool further. Now what happens is you scroll and you're like, I feel like I'm scrolling forever, and it's because you can scroll forever. It's designed that way. It's infinite scroll. That's true on Instagram, it's true on Twitter, it's true on pretty much any social media platform. All of this is by design. If you can remove every possible friction point, if you make the experience maximally fluent, people never hit a roadblock And it's those roadblocks that historically, think about the 20th century, those roadblocks were the things that said to us, maybe you want to do something different. You know, you'd watch a TV show, you get to the end of a 1-hour episode and you'd say, well, the next one's going to be a week from now. I'd probably better do something else rather than just sit in front of the box for the next, 7 days. Or you'd read a newspaper, and even if you were an avid reader, you'd get to the end of the newspaper and you'd have to get up, fold it away and do something different. The same with books. You'd get to the end of a chapter or the end of the whole book, you'd put it aside. Everything now, because it's digital, because it's on screens, can be engineered so that it seems or actually is bottomless. And that's a huge problem for people who are trying to manage how long they spend doing something. I think it's silly to say that screens are monolithic and that there's only one thing we do on screens and that it's all bad. That's ridiculous. So you have to carefully audit everything you do on a screen. If you spend 4 hours reading a book on a screen, that's very different from spending 4 hours scrolling through Instagram posts or Facebook, or writing 4 hours of emails, or spending 4 hours responding to texts, or spending 4 hours playing a game or learning a language. All of these are very different. They have different characteristics. And the screen is just the vehicle. It's delivering something to you, and it's a very effective delivery device. But what it delivers varies greatly. And so I think it's absolutely right to say we should not consider screen time as one thing. We should consider it as many different things, and we've got to be careful about parsing what those different things are and what their respective benefits and costs are. Having said that, I don't think that's a reason to say screens aren't bad for us, the fact that they're just diverse and that what we do on them is diverse. I think it's just a call to think more carefully about what we do. And it turns out when you ask people when they're engaging with a screen, in particular a phone, how happy are you doing the thing you're doing right now? They are least happy doing the things they spend the most time doing. So you find they spend 3 times longer on things like games, social media apps, email, and when you ask them how happy are you when you're doing those things, they're much less happy than they are doing the things they spend less time doing, like using educational apps, or checking the weather even makes them happier than that. So I think the data suggests that people are spending a lot of time doing the things that are not good for their well-being on screens. Yeah, well, let me start by saying I'm not opposed to fluency. I'm not opposed to removing frictions. I think the very best uses of things like phones are utility-based. So, it's hard to get from A to B. We'll make a map, and that'll guide you everywhere you go for the rest of your life. That's amazing. Google Maps is a miracle. I think it's one of the greatest inventions of the last 20 years. So I think the utilities that make our life easier are good. It's when you weaponize an experience that we shouldn't be spending all that much time on, that we will want to spend a lot of time on, that you have the problem of overly removing friction points. So it's not like people sit on Google Maps, which is made as easy as possible, brings a lot of benefit, and they say, well, I've now reached my destination, but this is really compelling. I'm just going to spend the rest of my day on Google Maps. It has a defined scope, and there are times when you're going to use it. It's not true for social media, for social feedback, for email, for things like that, that are just endless. For those, I think carefully placed friction points are bad for business, but really good for well-being. So imagine if every 5 minutes you were using, I don't know, let's say it's Facebook, and you got a reminder to do something else. It'd be annoying, but if you actually got off Facebook in 5 or 10 minutes instead of spending hours, in aggregate, you'd save years of your life and you'd probably be better off. So, one of the most interesting anecdotes was I spoke to a therapist who treats people who are very, very severe internet addicts. These are people that, I don't love that term, but these are people who spend a huge amount of time on screens, usually for games, online games, but for different reasons. And we were talking about video games, and she had been a gamer in the 90s and the 2000s, and she said, my favorite game was a game called Myst. And I said, why is that? And she said, because my computer was not quite strong enough to run Myst capably, and so every 30 minutes or so, it would just crash, and then I'd do something else. One of the reasons I think I enjoyed Myst so much, she said, was I knew that there was this not just friction point, but actual barrier to continuing to play. And that meant I could enjoy it while I was doing it, and I knew I wasn't going to get hooked. And she had this addictive personality in her. She found that she got hooked on a lot of things. So the fact that Myst had this friction point or disfluency built in was a strength for her. And I think if we could do that in more of our experiences more broadly that we found hard to resist, that would be good for us. So the Scott Adams idea that systems are better than goals, the goal basically says, here is a signpost, and when I reach this, I've succeeded. But there's something inherently broken about that system or that approach, because what it means is you're in a failure state until you reach the signpost, and then it turns out once you reach the signpost, it's a massive anticlimax, and you just create a more distant, harder to reach signpost. So you never really enjoy what you're doing, and you never really get much enrichment from it. The systems idea is an alternative, which is to say, let's imagine that your ultimate goal is to write a book. It's to write 100,000 words. That's a goal, and until you write 100,000 words, you haven't achieved it. But what Adam says is that you should have a system built in that's much less focused on how to get to the goal and much more focused on granularity between here and there. And so he says something like, either every day you will write for half an hour, or every day you'll write 500 words, or whatever it may be. And it doesn't matter that the quality doesn't matter. Don't worry too much about what you're doing. You just have this basic system, and it governs your life based on simple habits. Now, where there's this clash is that I think it's a problem when we focus too much on metrics, on numbers. So if you say, I'm going to write 500 words every day, you'll be to some extent obsessed with the number 500. That's problematic. But I think what happens over time is that system becomes ingrained, and you get very used to what it means to write 500 words. You recognize it on the page or on the screen, and you don't become so focused on 500. It's sort of a way of getting you started, but then a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, it's become a habit, and you just sit there and you write. And it tends not to just stick or hew too closely to that rule. And you do become much less mindful about the number and much more mindful about what you're writing. So I think it does work. And it certainly works better than being fixated on that number 100,000 at the end of the whole process of writing the book. So that's the suggestion. So I think it does work. It certainly has worked for me. There are people who have this idea of morning pages, where you wake up in the morning, you write a certain amount. Doesn't matter what you're writing or how good it is, it gets habits going, builds those habits over time. And so the artificial nature of doing that in the beginning falls away, and it starts to feel very natural. And I think that's what works about systems. Yeah, look, I think there are extremes, right? The one extreme is everything you do is its own thing. There is no transference between the skill you have in memorizing phone numbers and any other thing you ever do in your life. That's absurd. Obviously, we know that intelligence, for example, there is a sort of general construct that underlies all kinds of intelligence, from musical intelligence to reading, to writing, to mathematics, to learning languages. And that there is this overarching construct that's driving all of that to some extent. So there must be some overlap. I think what brain training games do is they massively overclaim. So if the one end of the spectrum is everything is distinct, brain training games basically say, spend a bit of time doing this thing, and that thing that's like 4 miles down the road will be better as a result. The link they're drawing there is actually very tenuous, and they're suggesting it's a strong link. And there's just no empirical evidence to suggest that doing this skill over here will help that skill that's way down the road. But I do think there's got to be a middle ground. I don't know exactly where it is, but I am certain that memorizing phone numbers has to be good for, if nothing else, the ability to memorize things, which is important. You memorize things all the time. Memorizing names when you meet people must make you socially more capable, right? If you are the kind of person who's memorized more phone numbers, there's a pretty good chance you will be better at memorizing names when you meet 12 people at a party, for example. That has to have carryover effects. So it's just a matter of working out exactly where between those two poles, between everything is distinct and everything overlaps, you should fall, or things do fall. I don't think we really know. I certainly don't know exactly, but it's something that's worth getting a sense of. And I think it's worth assuming there's some transference between these skills, even if you don't know exactly where those transferences happen and where they don't. Yeah, look, I think the reason we spend so much time on technology and why these programs and apps and platforms are so hard for us to resist is that we are generally mindless. So if you let them, they will control your life because they're designed very well. They capitalize on how humans approach rewards and how we are motivated to do certain things and not others and so on. But if you put structures in place ahead of time, so you craft your environment in a certain way or you cultivate certain kinds of habits, you're less likely to fall prey. So an example of this, a really simple example, is you could make the rule, I will never have a screen with me during dinner time. My kids, if you have kids, my friends, if you're out with friends, my family members, we will sit at the table and there will be no screens. Your kid may be screaming, that may have happened occasionally, and your kid may be demanding a screen, but if that habit becomes ingrained, that's at least a sanctuary for maybe 30 minutes a day or an hour a day where you won't have screens. Now that's a very mindful decision, it's a conscious decision, and in the beginning it's difficult to carry it out. But I think it's ultimately pretty enriching because it changes what that half an hour represents for a family every day. You know, other habits are really important. Things like not having screens in the bedroom is critical because the light you get from screens makes it harder to fall asleep and to stay asleep. It sort of induces a sort of jet lag. So if you're looking at a blue screen or a white screen and it's 10 p.m., your brain interprets that as daytime. It's like being jet lagged. And you know, there's a whole list of these kinds of interventions that require some doing in the beginning, but once they become a part of the way you live, they are ultimately going to be very good for you. And when you put them all together, you have this toolbox and you draw from all of those different tools. I think undoubtedly it makes you healthier and happier and better off. It's just a matter of recognizing what those things are and knowing what to do with that desire to be mindful, knowing where to concentrate that mindfulness.